I'd like to inform the audience that our next session, titled In the Language of Remembering the Inheritance of Partition, is about to start. I'd like to inform the audience that our panelists will be there at the author's desk. Everyone, please settle down. Our next session, In the Language of Remembering the Inheritance of Partition, Aanchal Malhotra in conversation with Dr. Seema Raizada. The partition of India in 1947 was the change of political borders and the division of other assets that accompanied the dissolution of the British Raj in the Indian subcontinent and the creation of two independent dominants in South Asia, India and Pakistan. May I please welcome Aanchal Malhotra ji. She is an oral historian, a writer from New Delhi. She is the co-founder of the Museum of Material Memory, a crowdsourced digital repository, traced family histories and social ethnography through heirlooms, collectibles, and antiques from the Indian subcontinent. She has written extensively on the 1947 partition and its related topics. Her first book, Remnants of a Separation, won the Council for Museum Anthropology Book Award 2022 and was shortlisted for the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar, British Academy Book Prize, Hindu Lit for Life Non-Fiction Prize, and many more. Her second book, In the Language of Remembering, tracing the long-term cross-border generational legacy of partition, was published in critical acclaim in early 2022 and named one of History Today's best books of the year. Her latest work is a debut novel titled The Book of Everlasting Things. Joining her, we have Dr. Seema Raizada. She is a professor of English at Maharani Lakshmi Bai Government Girls Postgraduate College, Bhopal, Shakespeare scholar who has her PhD and D.Lit degrees on the works of the Bard and has also authored a book titled Double Vision of Shakespeare, research guide and a subject expert to many institutions. She is the founder of Club Literati, which is an exclusive platform for both established and budding writers and artists, and all those who love to explore literature and other creative arts. Club Literati was recently rated as one of the best 5 reading clubs of India. She is editor-in-chief of Inkpad, a literature and arts quarterly. We are delighted to have you with us on the dais. May I please request you to initiate the conversation?
Thank you. Uh, Welcome to the Bhopal Literature Festival, Aanchal. Friends, after a pretty long and a very pleasant spell of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav that culminated, still, the spirit is still on. And we are marching ahead targeting Vision 2047. India has come a long way. India is dazzling. We just heard the experts before this session how India is taking on the world. And we feel happy about it, that we are living in these times. And yes, one of the expressions of this, that we are living in the happy times, that we are all sitting here in this very beautiful Antarang, attending the very colorful festival, Bhopal Literature Festival. So we have reasons to be happy, to feel happy about our present, and feel confident about our future. But India has come a long way since we got free from the bondage, the subjugation. But that was not all. And as the country was awakened to life and freedom, to quote Nehru in his famous Tryst with Destiny speech, there's something traumatic happened, we all know, as the country was divided into two. We have Aanchal, she's an oral historian, and she has written this book, a very lovely book, in the language of remembering the inheritance of partition. This book is very different in nature. Probably it takes us away from the gruesome, harsh images that probably, something like what we see on the cover of Fikr Toswi's The Sixth River. And we get so upset hearing the stories of violence, of turbulence, leaving numerous scars on people across who now live, and generations, the second and third generations who now live across the globe. Amidst this fact of partition, Aanchal has come up with this very different book, I should say, and it's not that she doesn't mention the scars, she doesn't mention the violence, she doesn't mention the disruption, but she also mentions, through the second-hand memories, through the memories of the descendants, as she calls, the stories that are relived through the inheritors of the sufferers, the first generation. So there is trauma, but at the same time, there is a pleasant episode, there's a pleasant mention of the fact, which gives us, this is a ray of hope that we get, that in one of the places that is mentioned in the book, the mosque, which was the place, or what was once a mosque, is used, as a gurudwara. The same structure is being used, is a gurudwara. They have not changed it. So isn't that a very, it's a very positive sign that we get through this book. So I welcome you, Aanchal, and compliment you for this lovely book. And believe me, this book is, a labor of love. And as I was carrying this book, I got several comments from my friends. You are carrying something, your own weight, something like that. So I said, book is worth, its weight in gold. In not, I would say, rather weight in words and emotions which form the crux of this book. So Aanchal, my first question to you about the genre of this book. How is this book different from the other partition books?
Well, thank you for that very, very complimentary introduction, and thank you for joining me here, everyone. It's the last session of the evening, so I appreciate you being here. This is a book of oral history, And for those of you that don't know, the methodology of oral history is focused on oral testimony collected by people who were present either at a particular historical event or seen through a particular lens, thematic lens. How this book is different from other books of partition, perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. Depends on your reading. But it looks at ordinary people's stories from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the diaspora. It looks at stories not just at the time of partition, but stories beginning from partition and continuing on, because partition is not a static event. Very often, I have a book before this as well, which looks at stories of survivors in India and Pakistan. I spent several years traveling between the two countries, recording stories of the older generation, people of my grandparents' generation. And one of the things they said to me very frequently, which my own grandmother echoes, is that we never wanted to pass on any of the memories to our descendants. We never wanted to pass on the pain, which meant for many of them, they passed on silence. Silence is the loudest carrier of stories with partition. And a good way to gauge this is to look within your own family about, if you are a partition impacted family, how much do you know about where your grandparents or parents came from and the specificities of their migration. Now, as I was interviewing these elderly people, and it's quite, there is a big distance between them and me. Not only am I very young, I know this and I was told several times, but there are also several generational gaps, and not to mention geographic gaps when you're interviewing Pakistanis or Bangladeshis. But the one thing they kept saying was that our younger generation doesn't know anything and we did not want to talk about it. And yet, when I spoke to the younger generation, sometimes they were present during our interview, they had things to offer on their own. Whether these are things they have garnered from collective memory, whether it is things that they have collected from the media, from films, from books they have read, that's regardless. But younger people always had something to say. Now, an oral archive, unfortunately, is not given as much weight in this country as the written archive. We believe, and this is a very Western notion, that if something is written down, then it is truth. We are a country of oral tradition. We have always been. And South Asia is like that. We are countries of oral tradition. We pass on our stories. So why does a story that your grandmother tells, or your mother or your uncle, not have as much weight as something that is written down? So the one thing I want to distinguish about oral history is that it relies on oral testimony, which is one version of the truth, just like a written archive is. The other place where this book differs maybe from other books on partition is that it relies on descendant narratives. Interviews of generation second, third, sometimes fourth after the survivor. While there is importance given to eyewitness accounts, there is very little given to descendant memory, as if memory does not pass down, as if silence does not pass down, as if grief, loss, hurt, all of these emotions, fear, bitterness, anger, othering, all of this cannot be passed down, but that is not true. It is very much passed down. Any event, when viewed through the prism of memory, will provide us innumerable versions of it. So what I have tried to do in this book is to interview younger people, people that were not physically touched by partition, but emotionally, intellectually, and in other ways, have found the route to partition, to see, I guess, to answer a very basic question: is partition relevant? Should we still talk about it? What does it mean to younger people? Is it run parallelly only with the politics of India and Pakistan? Does it mean different things for different people? And then the third, sorry to go on and on, but I'm going to stop just after this. The third part where I think this is a unique book is that it is structured through emotion. This is not a book divided by India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Its chapters are titled as belonging and borderlands and hope. There's a chapter on love. There's a chapter on the other. There is a chapter on separation. There is a chapter on loss. There's a chapter on grief, on fear. These things, these emotions are without national identity. Everyone feels love. Everyone has felt loss. Everyone has been separated, maybe not in the way of partition, but otherwise. And this felt like a categorization that was devoid of any ethnic, religious, or national difference, which we anyway constantly make between the three nations of between South Asia. So I think that is maybe how it differs from other books on partition.
Yes, Aanchal. I mean, this is something which I found very interesting, the categorization or the chapterization that Aanchal has done. And of course, she has done it alphabetically.
Yeah, because I don't want to give any.
Yes, no prominence or no, she has not prioritized any one particular emotion. So these are emotion or action-based chapterization. That is something very unique. And she mentioned a few emotions, like fear, love, grief, hope, discovery. I mean, each chapter you would find that there are 4 to 5 different stories from different countries. The countries, of course, mainly involved India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And people, of course, spread over, across continents. So as Aanchal mentioned, how the younger generation, the third generation, sometimes the fourth generation, coming in, even a little girl coming into the conversation sometimes, how they reacted to the memories and as she put it, the willingness to share and sometimes the silence. So the descendants that she mentioned, people that she interacted with. So first of all, Aanchal, I'd like to know, how did you select the descendants, these people? How did you choose these people? Because there are, I think if you must have made a count of them, there may be more than 100, I don't know, around 100? Because there's so many people that are involved and from different places. So what was your kind of criteria? Were there any in choosing the descendants?
No. No criteria, no one, I said no to nobody. Actually, I should preface this by saying I worked on this book for 9 years. In that time, when I was working on my book with survivors, lots of younger people would come up. When you're discussing a book in a forum like this, often people come up and say, I have a story, or, this happened to my grandmother, this happened to my father. And I would always say, can I take your contact? Can we discuss this at length? Yeah, actually, काफ़ी बुरी बात है, because you end up being a very heavy person when you always tell everybody, of course, I'll listen. Which is what I did for several years. So conferences like this, or once people understand that you're a scholar of some seriousness in a particular subject, they will reach out. Also keep in mind, in our countries, there is no, ab to chalo, there is Partition Museum in Amritsar, in Delhi, in Calcutta. Before that, there was no physical space where we could go to see people like us, people who had been impacted by partition. There was no physical space where we could go and grieve, mourn, understand. So people gravitate to scholars and they tell their stories to us. So for many years I collected these stories. I didn't really say no to anybody, but these descendant stories were always side research for me, because already it was so complicated and difficult to make people understand that the statistical understanding of partition, which is 15 million people displaced and 1 million people killed, is only a statistic. It means that behind each of those numbers is a person, is a story, and each of those stories is different. This is the statistic that we learn in our schools. So it was already so complicated to make people understand that there are millions of stories, in fact, from partition, that I felt, who would understand a second-hand story? How much emotion can be felt in second-handedness? Because if I feel my grandparents' loss, it's not the exact loss that they are feeling, because I've never lost homeland, but I can empathize with it. It is it is at a distance. It is a second-handed emotion at a distance, which is also a valid emotion, because you must see how a historical event is carried through the generations. So, for 8 or 9 years, I kept collecting these stories, and then they became quite a collection, and they became quite varied in the kinds of things they said, in the kinds of landscapes they were from, in the kind of emotions that they garnered. And when I started to put it together, I thought to myself that these are like, I think, 130 stories, and this book is something like 800 pages, which already is like a big joke with people I know, that you've written such a big book, and I use it as a paperweight, and if someone is angry with me, I swat them with it. But think about this. This is only the tip of the iceberg. For everyone that willingly spoke, there were people who were hesitant to speak. For everyone that had language to vocalize how they felt, there were people that didn't have language. And language is not always verbal, particularly with events like a partition. There are many kinds of languages. So, for everyone that didn't have language, there was also denial, that they didn't want to know about partition. Now think about how many people there are with stories unrecorded, unaccepted, unknown. So in that sense, it is a very small effort to archive something that is very, very large and will have and has had so many varied repercussions for us. We had a conversation earlier today about Pakistan. Stems from partition. There are so many things about our geopolitical, social, cultural landscape, divided things that stem from partition. So it is an effort to capture those things.
So, Aanchal, you just mentioned about, sometimes when there was few words, more of action, more of expression, emotions. Can I quote from, this beautiful episode of this one woman, which comes under the chapter Fear. The lady, from Mirpur, and when she came, I just would like to, read those beautifully put sentiment here. When Aanchal says, I want to ask her more, but her son tells me that this is enough. The son comes along with this old lady, who was a little hunched and not very clearly visible. He begins to stand up and expects me to do the same, and I scramble with my recorder and notebook and pen. I look at the woman, still sitting, still touching her necklace, and ask him whether I can photograph her. He's quick to tell me that she doesn't like to be photographed, but I tell him how I am interested in her hands. The way they sit folded in her lap, the way they find their way to her necklaces, the way they reveal. There is beauty in her hands, I say, and rather unenthusiastically he agrees. I lead her into the light of the veranda right by the front door. She walks slowly, hunched over, gently placing the one step after another. When she sinks into the beige plastic lawn chair, she lets out a sigh. And then Aanchal says, your hands. I gesture to her, she says, can I see your hands? Now there are no words spoken here. This is something which is, body which also acts as a memory. She humors me. I'll just read this line and then just, bring out the emotion in these lines. She humors me by stretching them out, turning them around as my camera captures the fine lines. And, as she is watching intently, she feels her hands. Her hands remind me of my grandmother's, for they have the same soft to the touch, lathered daily with Pond's cold cream feel. And then what happens? Would you like to continue with this?
I'll tell you the full story, but firstly, everybody knows what grandmother's hands feel like, because they're so synonymous to old age and tenderness. हर रोज़ पॉन्ड्स कोल्ड क्रीम लगाना, and plus I live in Delhi, तो हर रोज़ और भी लगाते थे. Very cold. This lady, she was from a place called Mirpur, which is now in Pakistan. And why I went to her is a rather sad and interesting story. She lived in Jammu. She passed away a few years ago. And I went to interview her because I was told by somebody that she had been abducted for several months and kept inside Pakistan after partition. And I went to ask her about that. Now, a few key things in this interview which you have read out. One, it is obviously an interview that is very sensitive. So I went there to ask her what happened in those months that you were taken, you were kept. She was taken on horseback with a son who was 1 year old, not the same son that was sitting in the room with us. But as I'm sitting there, it becomes very clear that there are things she is allowed to say and things she is not allowed to say, which should tell you sometimes the autonomy of women in telling their stories. What is the language we use to tell our stories? What are the spaces that we have where stories feel safe to tell? How do we verbalize, voice our stories in our words without men giving us permission? Because every time I asked her a question, she would look towards her son and he would say whether she could answer or not. Now I understand this because obviously it's a very sensitive story and there are aspects of shame attached to an abduction. So there are things that they want to conceal, they want to keep for the honor of the family, which is fine. So what she did tell me was she was taken, she gave me the dates that she was returned. And when I calculated, as per the calendar, she was not taken for a month, as I was told, but a full year. A full year. I wanted to ask her what had happened in that year. How were you kept? She told me very brief details about the fact that there were other ladies with her, some young enough to be her children, which should tell you already enough. And then, as I was asking her more things, he gets up. And he expects me to do the same, which you read out. Now I am not ready to leave. So I make up this excuse that I want to photograph her, but you know, she has a very old face. She was in her late 80s, early 90s when we met. Very, very, very old face. So I said, I want to photograph her, and he said, no, she doesn't like to be photographed. So then I said, her hands. What can hands tell us? Nothing and everything. They can tell us everything if we are looking for something there. So we walk outside to the veranda. She sits down on this beige chair and I'm photographing her hands and she's humoring me like this. She probably thinks I'm some stupid city girl. It's come from Delhi to speak to her and I was looking at her hands. But I don't know, something changed in her then. And she holds my arm like this and she says to me, because her son was not around, she says to me, a few months after it happened, a few months after I came back, I received a letter with my name on it. A letter came to my house with my name on it. And I thought for sure it was them, the abductors. What if they had found me? Now there was so much palpable fear in her voice, in her grip, which 67 years after partition, that's how long it had been, I could still feel. I could feel her fear in her body, in my body. And I wanted to say to her, what if it was a bill? What if it was your sister writing you a letter? But she said, what if it was the abductor? And I had no heart to say anything to her. So the emotion that you feel most prevalently at the time, it carries on and it is strong and it can be passed on. And I will never forget that tone in her voice. And I was very privileged to have had that small conversation. And the fact that she felt safe enough with just the two of us to say that to me, you know. Thank you for bringing up that conversation. It was very important for me as well.
Yeah, so stories like these run along the book. I mean, this is the chapter which is titled Fear, and there are, about 4 or 5 stories, something like this. And when I read this part, believe me, I was left teary-eyed. It's something we could relate to our grandmothers, our mothers' hand, with wrinkles. I mean, I could feel that emotion. And this is what Aanchal has done in her book. So, Aanchal, another aspect of the of oral history is people generally as happened with so many descendants in the book that when they try to talk to their first generation people, they were not very keen on disclosing. It happened with you as well.
Many times.
So Aanchal also has, her great-grandfather coming to India, and the famous Bahari Sons book shop in Khan Market that was started by him. And later on, when why don't you share that story with your grandmother when you wanted to know
Well,
from
yeah, actually, I'll read a
her?
little bit because she was very, she wasn't just hesitant. She just had never spoken to anyone about partition, which I found quite surprising.
No one asked. I mean, this is
No
what.
one asked.
Yes.
But it's also surprising because my grandparents lived in a refugee camp for nearly 10 years, which is a very common thing with partition-impacted families, that they lived in camps and then those camps became neighborhoods and then those neighborhoods became kind of refugee neighborhoods. But truly, no one had asked my grandmother, and also my grandparents firmly looked ahead and they were very reticent to speak about that time. So just very briefly, I want to read what she said. So this is me asking her just a very simple question. So then, when did you first talk to someone about partition? I asked my grandmother one evening. It's been 7 years since we first spoke about her experiences of migrating from Dera Ismail Khan in the Northwest Frontier Province to Delhi in 1947, and I'm curious about whether there has been a memory keeper in the family before me. When you asked about it all these years ago, she answers nonchalantly. My mouth drops slightly open. No, surely that couldn't have been the case. Surely 66 years couldn't have passed before she began talking candidly about possibly the most devastating event of her life. I knit my eyebrows together and cup my face in my palms, unsure of how to continue the conversation. Then my eye catches the wedding portraits of my grandparents hung above her bed. Several years ago, at a conference in Bangalore, I had seen a presentation about how men and women who had been part of the Italian resistance during World War II often ended up marrying one another, for no one else would understand what they had been through. Who else can I speak to about this? They asked. At this time, it had left a very deep impression on me, and I wondered whether couples who had both lived through partition found solace in the fact that they could speak to one another about it, that the other would understand. When I asked my grandmother if this is the case, my grandparents had met in the Kingsway refugee camp in 1948 after all, she dismisses it with a click of her tongue. Partition happened, we came from D.I. Khan, they came from Malakwal. He was in college at the time, that's all I knew. But I never asked how he felt about it, and neither did he. Imagine that. I try and inquire further, but this is not a topic she wants to discuss, so I veer towards the second generation, their children. I ask her, did anyone ever ask you? No, never. What would they know about what a partition was? That was her answer. What would they ever know about what a partition was? So imagine, probably one of the most traumatic moments of your life, and the first time you talk about it is 66 years after it happened, when someone asks. And the problem is also that we don't know how to ask the questions. We are, as countries that are born from so much violence and so much disparity and separation and othering and such traumatic consequences of decolonization, we don't know how to question that event. We don't know how to start asking. When we learn about this in school, the first question we should ask when we come home as children at the age of 11 or 12, when we first learn about what this partition is, we should come home and say, do you know what this partition is, Mom? You should ask your grandmother. Did you live through this thing? But we are not. And so partition. And I was very surprised at how many people I spoke to said that it was quite an effort to get their family to talk about it. Because once you know your family comes from the other side, there are so many questions. There are so many questions about land and belonging and loss that flood your mind, at least flooded my mind.
Thanks, Aanchal. Aanchal's, eventually, of course, they had a, they got married. They met there and they got married. And so this the chapter on love, again, it's full of such 3 or 4 stories which take you to the times when things were not probably too much in their favor, but yet they managed to come together. So the message, of course, that the love, it's cannot be bound, or any positive emotion cannot be bound. There are several instances in the book when we feel that these boundaries, the partition, did not perhaps make much difference. It did, but then in certain cases did not. At the same time, Aanchal, now I just got the instruction that we have to wind up this session, and another 5 minutes maybe. So one last question to you. Your first book, Remnants of a Separation, it was widely acclaimed and, of course, nominated for, shortlisted for several awards. Could you please tell us something about this material memory? And then after that, we can open the floor for questions.
So when I began my work on partition, it was 2013. I was 23, and I had just come home. I was living in Canada at the time. I had come home on a short sabbatical before I started my thesis. And the reason why I came back to India is because I had no ideas for my thesis. So when I was in India, I thought to myself, okay, well, if the idea comes, it comes organically. And at the time, I was introduced to 2 objects that my family had carried from Lahore to Amritsar. And these were such ordinary objects. It was a vessel in which lassi is made, a ghada, and a guz, a yardstick, used in a clothing store. And they were so ordinary that I probably saw them my whole life and didn't really ask anything about them. But when those objects were taken out on that day, and they were talked about, all of a sudden, my grandfather and his elder brother started talking about their childhood in Lahore, which had really never happened before that. And they started talking about it in such a visceral way. As they were touching the ghada, or they were telling me how to use the guz, they were saying, the lane in which I used to go to school, and the bicycle I used to ride on, and the chilgoza I used to eat. I don't know what chilgoza is in English. Pine nuts. All of these things are really kind of such ordinary things. And as they were speaking about it, I was fascinated how a simple object could transport them not just back into the past, but across this very heavy militarized border. And they said things like, we cross the border in our dreams every day because that's the only way we will return home. Till then, no one from my family had gone back, which is a sad reality for many people who are partition-impacted families. So I saw those 2 objects, and I couldn't stop thinking about them. Obviously, everybody else who was present that day didn't really understand what was happening, but for me, I was sort of fixated with the idea that an object is a portal, and a belonging can tell you about the notion of belonging. So for the next 3 or 4 years after that, I ended up traveling across India and Pakistan and interviewing Bangladeshis, though I have not been there, about the things that they carried. And they were always very funny conversations, because I wasn't asking, like, tell me about the enormity of memory that still remains. I was saying, well, why did you carry this ring with you? Okay, it was your mother's. Okay, why did she pack this? Okay, it was valuable. Why didn't you sell it when you came here? How did she know she had to pack valuable things? When did you hear about partition? And the reason why I chose the aid of objects is because to ask unaided felt so intrusive. To say to somebody, tell me the most traumatic period of your life in great detail, to me, almost always who was a stranger to them, it felt too invasive. And plus, I think, as I said earlier, there was not enough vocabulary at the time. So we were also building a vocabulary as we were going along. Oral history of partition is very young. It only started in the late 80s, early 90s. So the vocabulary is still very much being built. So the object helped to speak about the past, because it told you about the ethnographic landscape that they had left behind at partition, and of course details surrounding the object. And I wrote my first book on that.
Thanks, Aanchal. And can we have questions now?
I don't have a question. Mike. Volunteers, Mike, please.
Just thank you for this session, Dr. Raizada and Aanchal. So evocative. And, my daughter has asked me about partition, and
I'm
one
so
gives
glad.
a very factual answer. And this is when my husband's family is a partition-impacted family, and his grandfather is with us. He's 96 years old. But thank you for this session. I think the next time we go back home,
Using an object.
yes, and also
very helpful.
make them have this conversation, because somehow it just never enters our system that this is a conversation that's also possible between a 10-year-old and a 96-year-old man who's
And
seen
you would be very
partition.
surprised at the
Yeah.
kinds of questions children ask.
Yes.
There was a story in my first book about a lady who talked about being a child. She was like 4 years old at the time of partition. Children who were 12 years old read that story because they related to her naive, childlike perspective of that time to understand what partition may have felt like for a child. And I didn't really think it was 12-year-old safe, that book. But the kinds of questions they asked was not, oh, tell me about the geopolitics between India and Pakistan. They asked, well, how will I know if someone is a Pakistani if I see them?
No, I agree with you, because my daughter asked these questions, and we are an army family, so that is another angle. And then she has so many questions about it, and somehow one feels not equipped enough to answer. But I think a lot of things that you spoke about today made a lot of sense.
I'm
So
very
thank you.
glad.
Just
Thank
wanted
you.
to share this with you.
So there's another question. How many questions can we take? Two more?
Hi, Anchal, my question is, with the kind of perennially online lives we live today and the kind of traumas around us, we're always chronicling our own histories. And with your research, what do you think is changing from the times of partition that you've experienced towards the chronically online times that we are in today with the traumas around the world?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Well, I know that the aspect of journaling is very different, and it takes place in various shapes and forms. The one thing that I was very struck by always when I was speaking to elderly people about their experiences of partition and before is that they could always pinpoint, like, maybe it had been 70 years that they had migrated from this one place, but they could pinpoint the route that they took to play in this one bagicha. Or, we used to walk for, like, let's say 10 minutes from here to here, then we used to go here. Like, they could draw full maps.
Even the dates, I believe.
The dates, the villages, the cities, full maps of these places from mere memory. Now, if you ask me or someone younger than me to do that, we can't do that because we rely so much on our smartphones, on the internet. We don't need to remember those details. And in my opinion, we are at a loss for it. We are also gaining a lot, but we are very much at a loss for it as well. So I don't know. That's a very personal question to ask about chronicling and archiving. Social media has helped me a lot in my work, but it can also be seen as detriment to the actual act of remembering.
Some of the interviews I believe you had on, from the other countries over a video call. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. Yes. Yeah.
So,
go ahead.
yes.
Yeah, it's you, definitely.
First of all, ma'am, I would like to thank you so much because I'm an architecture student. And when you said that there is this there is no placemaking for the entire idea of material memory, one of my best friends who lives in Delhi is a victim of partition, fourth generation now. And she was heavily dependent on your research for her thesis. So I would really like to thank you for that.
Thank you. That's
And
very kind.
I would like to ask you a question that what would be your message so as budding architects, and since this is age of so much information, I would like to ask you what would you say to the entire idea of placemaking, which is very architectural.
Great question.
Which is connected to the idea of material memory, because her entire project was based in Khan Market and a museum and the idea came from material memory and collective memory. So what would be your stance on the entire idea of placemaking through material memory?
What for you is the shape of the house of the past? What does the house of the past look like? No, it's not like it's not like a clapping question. It's just a genuine question to people. The house of the past doesn't exist because it is a place of memory. It is always changing. It is always shifting. This is also not a concept of mine. It is something that one of my interviewees, who is doing a PhD in architecture from Lahore, asks about Lucknow, where her family is from. Is memory enough to conjure spaces of the past? Is that the role of memory?
Yes, ma'am, quite a provocative question.
That's what she thinks as well. So she doesn't think it's necessary enough for her to go to Lucknow. She's not interested in going to Lucknow because the Lucknow that she is studying from pre-partition doesn't exist now.
Yes, ma'am.
Right? Just like if I go to Northwest Frontier Province, I go to the village of my grandmother, I will find a different place. I will not find a place of memory, which is also why some people are quite disappointed when they go back, and some people are unwilling to go back because they don't want to distort the place of memory. Right? The house of the past is an invisible one. This is Georges Perec, it's not me, who is an excellent writer, dead now. You should all read. But memory is enough to construct the house of the past. It is ample, right? Which should tell us that we can construct an entire lifestyle of the past and stand in the house of the past and have it be erect and be enough, right? Which is also a way for us to make ourselves feel a little bit better about not being able to physically go there. The one thing I used to ask when, sometimes, social media is really great and it helps you connect, not you, but other people you have interviewed, to the cities and villages they left behind by other people. So one time I managed to find an interviewee of mine, a contact to the exact street that his mother left. And this woman on the other side in Pakistan, her father was the lambardar of that village. Lambardar is like the caretaker. He said, okay, I'm going to show you around, and he took the phone and the house was there. And it's incredible to know that 70, 75, 76 years later, a house is standing, right? Now he asked me a question. He says, the thing I asked myself all these years, if the house was still standing, did it know that my mother was thinking about it? Was it waiting for someone to come? And what does it mean when someone rehabitates a house of the past? These are all just questions. I don't have answers for them, but there's just something for us to think about the house of the past. Yeah.
So the memory, I feel, there was one question. Someone else? Yes, please.
Thank you.
I think this is
for your
going to
question.
the last.
Yeah.
Then we'll
The last question for tonight.
Thank you so much, Aanchal, for that very, very insightful session. I myself teach literature here at ISER Bhopal.
We've been exchanging emails for a very long time.
Yeah, so I had a couple
Antara.
of, yes. If I have time, else I'll go with one. My first question was about method. We all know that oral histories take a very long time to build that trust, and you mentioned how your interlocutors would often not be able to speak because you were a stranger. So if you could shed a bit more light on how that relationship was built over time, and also, your own, you talked about how loss, grief are passed on. So your own inheritances, because I myself was from the other side, what role did that have in your, in your work of a historian? So that was one. I think I'll stop there.
Such a great, so two very great questions you asked. The first is about trust. Very often, I guess I should say that for me, an interview is not a transaction. So it is not that I'm going to go speak to someone once and then that's it. It's very common for me to stay in touch with every single interviewee of mine for years. And when they have passed, unfortunately, many of them have, to stay in touch with their children and grandchildren and so and so and so. So I really see it as a relationship, kind of building a very big family across the three nations. But when you meet someone for the first time and you're sitting with them, it's awkward. And even though they know that you have come to ask about partition, they have no obligation to speak to you about it. And old people have their own things, आज नहीं बात करनी, बड़े थक गए हैं, मन नहीं है, उसके बारे में नहीं सोचना है. And yet, it is your duty to continue to make that relationship. So, sometimes we used to spend many hours talking about nothing. And by nothing, I mean their children. We used to have chai, coffee, lunch, tambola game. You see, you have to make someone believe that you genuinely care about what they are going to say, particularly if they are elderly, because in the older generation, there is palpable loneliness. There is often even alienation. And by that, I don't mean that no one comes to see them. What I mean is no one really cares about the things that they are saying in many families. So if you are there to speak to someone, you have to make them believe that you care about their version of events. Very often when I was in Pakistan, people would say to their families, she has come from Delhi to speak to me. See, this means that my time with them means something to them. The fact that they can speak uninterrupted for 4, 5, 6 hours should they wish to means something to them. It also means sometimes I have missed trains, I have missed flights, I have, completely derailed the schedule of the day because the thing that they are talking about is important enough for me to listen to. Sometimes people have said to me, I've been speaking for so many hours about so many sad things. Aren't you tired? Yes, I am tired, but I'm here, I'm listening. Because this may be the first time you've spoken to someone about it, and that means something. It means something for people to have their story written, to know that it will be read, hopefully be learned from in the future. It means something. Sometimes when you go back, I have this tradition where after the book is published, I take it back to the person to have them sign on my page. So this book is like a book of, like a really interesting codex of signatures and messages. They often read their story. They know it's in the book. They've read it before it's been published. They've edited it. This is the version they have approved. This is the ethics of interviewing as well. They will read their story, and throughout the thing, they'll be nodding. Yeah, aisa hi hua tha. It was like this. Reaffirming to themselves. And these are small gestures you pick up, along the way. What was your second question? A kind of longish one, right? No, sorry. My answer was
I think
I'll answer it later.
Answer over a cup of tea outside. So thank you very much, Aanchal. And I'm sure this is our maybe takeaway from the session, that it is important to have a conversation at home, to have a conversation. I see so many youngsters sitting here. Please spend time with your parents and grandparents, probe them, prod them, and know from them try to know from them if they have anything to share. And that is something which will not only, help you. Not that it's something, it doesn't matter whether it's a sad memory or a happy memory. Memories are there. Certain moments are frozen in time. But yes, we do have them. We do carry them. And something as intangible as the memories or something which there remains inside, maybe something, the organs that are not even visible. So thank you very much, Aanchal, for giving us this beautiful book to read, and thanks everybody for sparing your time and listening to this wonderful rendering of this book by Aanchal Malhotra. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such an incredible session. As much as we want to continue, we have our constraints. For anyone who have any questions, we have the authors at the authors signing desk. You can just speak to her there. Moving forward, may I please request Raghav Chandra ji, the president of the Society for Culture and Environment, to please come forward and felicitate the author and the discussant with a memento as a symbol of our love, respect, and gratitude. The memento, ladies and gentlemen, is also the mascot of Bhopal Literature Festival 2024. It is a gone painting by the senior most gone artist, Ram Singh Urvati ji. It's a beautiful motif which depicts evolution of life. I'd like to inform the audience that now Bahirang has been shifted here. And over to you, Siddharth.
Thank you.